So where are we then? Marathon, not a sprint. The hope here is from the Europeans and Zelensky is that before we could get to a possible deal like the deal that we're talking about, the Americans don't cut off their military aid. They don't cut off their financial aid. And in the meanwhile, they step up the pressure on Russia, because that's the other part of the statements that are coming out today. And for those people who are coming out there and say, you've been saying this for 3.5 years, Russia's going to collapse. That's not what we're saying here. We're not talking about the Russian economy collapsing. We're talking about their ability to continue to wage a full-scale invasion.
Scott Lucas, a professor of US and international studies at Clinton Institute at the University of College Dublin. Thank you so much for joining this special edition of the Trump Report today.
Thank you. It's great to work on a Sunday, isn't it?
It is. You and I are always meeting each other on a Sunday or on a day off for work, but such is life when, of course, these big global things happen, such as a meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin that took place on Friday afternoon or Friday overnight for you and I over in the UK. So first off, Scott, I've had 2 guests on the show since this meeting happened, and every single guest, we need to start off. What was your reaction to this meeting and the aftermath?
Well, Maddie, when you and I talked to set this up, I think I said, and I think we kind of agreed, neither one of us expected this to be like the deal of the century or peace in our time. On the one hand, the Europeans and Vladimir Zelensky had really worked hard on Trump so that he at least didn't completely come out as Putin's ventriloquist dummy at the end and say, this is the deal. Russia gets all of Ukraine, or 20% of Ukraine, and sanctions are lifted on Moscow. So Trump didn't make any commitments on behalf of the Kremlin. On the other hand, there was no way that Russia was going to agree to the ceasefire as the priority, which is what Zelensky and Europe are pushing for. And even though Trump had gone into the meeting saying, they'll have to ceasefire, or I'm going to get really tough with them and there'll be sanctions, as soon as he met, it was going to be Putin. We don't think that's going to happen. And so here's my reaction, Maddie, if you really want it, because I'm really keen on these meetings that you read between the lines, you read body language, you read reactions, right? So I'm watching Trump waiting on the tarmac when Putin comes out of the plane. And there's always in diplomacy, there's always a fencing as to who shows up first, how long they have to wait for them and so on. So Trump's having to wait for a bit of time, but then it's like, yay, it's Vlad. It's my friend Vlad. He's here. And he's clapping like a seal, right? And like three rounds of applause. And by the way, the White House was so embarrassed by that when they put out the footage later on the video, they edited that out. I mean, even they knew it was like over the top. But anyway, he's clapping, and then Vlad, he's got his arm around Vlad. Vlad, you're here. Vlad, you're here. Look, I had these soldiers lay out a red carpet for you underneath your big plane that says Russia. Look at the image that causes, right? And look, here's all my military lined up. And look at here. Here's this podium we're going to stand on. And of course, Trump's quite tall. I think he's 6'3", right? So he's quite tall. Vladimir's wearing lifts because he's, so he's not as short as he usually are. And they're like, yeah, waving and so on. And the reporters are shouting questions, and Vlad's going, what? Oh no, I don't understand you. Sorry, sorry, no. And that's it. And then they're off into the beast, into Trump's limousine. Now I set all that up because I was on call with you folks, you great folks, but we didn't think the press conference was going to be until about 2 or 3 in the morning, our time. And I love you all so much, but I wasn't going to wait up that long, right? So you use someone from stateside. But anyway, I was just about to go to bed at 12:30, and then the flash came across that the boys are coming out. Now, they were supposed to only come out after an initial meeting, which was a 3-on-3, Donald Trump, Marco Rubio, Trump's envoy, real estate developer Steve Witkoff, and then Vlad's there with the foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, and with his top foreign policy aide, Yuri Ushakov. So they're supposed to have that. Then they're supposed to have a wider delegations meeting. And that's supposed to be the big meeting. And then they're going to have a working lunch. And the Kremlin's saying this is going to be 6 to 7 hours. In the end, they're showing up only about 2 hours after the first meeting. And it's going to be the only meeting. The second meeting and the lunch were canceled. Vlad comes in. He's all business, right? Trump comes in and he looks like a whipped dog. I mean, absolutely looks like a whipped dog. You know, Putin's going up there in his lifts, so he got a little bit of height on him up there. Unusually, he speaks first. It is always protocol at these meetings that the host speaks first. Always. But Trump doesn't do that. Instead, Vlad speaks and he grabs the narrative, right? There's going to be no mention of a ceasefire. Instead, Russia's going to stick with the root causes of the conflict. That's their terms for their ultimatum, right? This war that was foisted upon them by Europe and Ukraine, we're going to defend our national interest. Putin's coming out and effectively saying, I'm not giving an inch, right? Trump, the whole time, is nervous, he's fidgety, he's looking hunched, and he's not beaming anymore. And when they go over him to speak, and I know we're going to get the comments in YouTube, hi, all you Trump supporters out there, and you're going to come after us for this. But I'll ask you all, you go in and you give me a single coherent sentence out of what Trump said in what was a word salad. He comes out, and I think you could make out, great progress, great progress. It's a 10. It's a 10 out of 10 on a meeting. He says absolutely nothing of substance, nothing whatsoever. And interestingly, because Trump loves to talk usually, no questions. No questions even from his friendly reporters who would have been planted in there, right? And he's out. After 12 minutes of that press conference, Putin's off, heading back to Russia, and Trump's shuffling off, trying to figure out how he's going to puff himself back up while he's aboard Air Force One. So you want my takeaway from it? Immediately coming out of that, so it's like, okay, I've got the meeting. You folks have got, your folks lined up. I don't have to talk until the next day about all of this. But I'm thinking what you have had is, it wasn't option one that Trump went in there and held his ground on the ceasefire and on the need for Russia to stop its attack on Ukraine civilians. It wasn't option two, thank God, that he didn't completely fold and then simply say, I'm accepting all of Russia's demands. It was option three. Putin has flipped him so that the ceasefire is no longer the priority, and so that Trump is no longer talking about toughened sanctions on Moscow. Now, it's important to emphasize option three, because a lot of the press over the weekend have been saying, that's it, Putin won, that's it, bang, bang, bang. This was always going to be just simply another signpost in the marathon, because what you and I are about to talk about is Zelensky and the Europeans are smart enough to know this could have gone this way, and they were already making their preparations for how they then regain the advantage with Trump, which is by Saturday, the Europeans have got the statements out of support for Ukraine. Zelensky's got his statements out. Today, as you and I are talking, they're on the conference call, the video call of the Coalition of the Willing. And tomorrow, Zelensky's going out into Washington. But unlike last time in February, when he got ambushed by J.D. Vance, he's got friends. And it's interesting. Here's the confirmed lineup. The call last week with Trump. So the people working with Zelensky, 9 Europeans. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, European Council President Antonio Costa, NATO head Mark Rutte, the heads of 6 countries, UK, France, Italy, Germany, Poland, Finland. Going with Zelensky tomorrow are at least 4 and possibly 6 of those people. Von der Leyen, confirmed. Finland Stubb, and it's important he's going because he's a golfing buddy of Trump. Trump really likes him. He's going. Georgia Maloney, and it's important she's going because Trump fancies her. Confirmed. Keir Starmer, because he handed Trump the invitation to come here and meet the king and he's confirmed. And we think Friedrich Merz, actually it's 5, I should say. Friedrich Merz, confirmed. So that's your 5th. And then I think Macron's going as well.
He is, and Mark Rutte.
And Rutte as well now. You're up on me there. That's 7. So that's 7. That's 7 out of the 9. I think that leaves only Costa, who is important in his own way, but he's not high profile like von der Leyen, and the Polish president. Those are the only 2 out of the 9 who are not going. So, this in some ways will be believe it or not, it'll be an even more important meeting than what happened on Friday, because then we're really going to get where Trump goes. Uh, I mean, I'll put it this way. Look, Trump's a yo-yo, and I can use that term in multiple senses, but Trump's a yo-yo in that you pull his string and he'll go in a different direction. And the Europeans and Zelensky had pulled his string last week to try to toughen him up a bit. And they did to an extent. They did a hell of a job, actually. Then Putin pulled his string on Friday. Now you get the attempt by the Europeans and Zelensky to pull his string tomorrow. What we don't know yet, and this is the interesting part, is who's in the room with Trump on the American side. That's going to be really interesting. If it's Witkoff, the disadvantage of real estate developer Steve Witkoff is that he doesn't know what's going on, so the Kremlin can always manipulate him. And he's just said some crazy things within the past hour, which I'll tell you about. The advantage of Steve Witkoff is he's so clueless that he's almost a non-entity in these meetings. But, Marco Rubio, where's he going to position himself as Secretary of State? And is J.D. Vance going to be there? Because J.D. was not in Alaska. He's been over here, been out visiting you good folks in England and the Cotswolds, hanging out with a lot of British right-wingers, hard right-wingers, by the way. Another story for another time. So does JD insert himself back in there like he did in February? And that's kind of a wild card for Monday.
Well, you mentioned this option too, Scott, and it would feel as if Zelensky and Europe would have sighed a breath of relief coming off that meeting on Friday, knowing that, yes, sadly, a ceasefire wasn't brokered or even mentioned, but at least they haven't been sold down the river just yet. At least there's time. So this time comes tomorrow when, as you mentioned, these 9 leaders will go to DC with the meeting with Donald Trump. Now, this will be different from February, as you mentioned, in the Oval Office, that ambush situation. Zelensky has friends now, as you said. So how do you think European leaders and Zelensky need to play this with Trump?
I can tell you how they're playing it. And that's the interesting thing, because there's 2 other things that happened on Friday that are significant. The first is that it's what Trump did not say off the U.S. side. The difference between where we are now and where we were in the spring is that Trump had cut military and financial aid to Ukraine. We're in a position now where the U.S. has restored military aid to Ukraine, albeit by selling the arms to NATO members who then give them to Ukraine. Now, Trump has not indicated he's cutting that off. So there's a slight difference, important difference in position. But secondly, the Europeans have been mentioning, and look at every statement they mentioned today, they're mentioning security guarantees for Ukraine. And they're saying they're welcoming Donald Trump committing to the U.S. being involved in security guarantees for Ukraine. Now, they're not defining what those guarantees are, but if Trump has mentioned that he's amenable to security guarantees, that's huge. And then this is the quirk that's happened in the past hour. Sunday morning political talk shows, big thing in the States. They always trot out there to get their lines out. Real estate developer Steve Witkoff has been on with CNN, and he has said that Russia has agreed to the U.S. and Europe providing a NATO-type security guarantee, what we call an Article 5 guarantee for Ukraine. Now that's huge, because that means if Ukraine is attacked, the guarantee is that Europe and U.S. come to Ukraine's defense. Now, Russia has never been willing to accept that. It's not just they're not willing to accept NATO membership for Ukraine. They're not willing any type of security guarantee, which is similar to a NATO-type guarantee for Ukraine. Yet Witkoff is telling folks that they've agreed to it. So something has happened, and we don't know the extent of this, but a security guarantee from the United States for Ukraine at this point appears to be on the table. And that, I think, is the lever that the Europeans and Zelensky work on Monday. They don't go back and push the ceasefire first and foremost with Trump. What they say here is, if we're going to go to a deal, let's get the security guarantee locked in. And this is presented to the Russians. This is not negotiated with the Russians. This is presented to the Russians. That, I think, will be one of the key plays they make.
And I think that these comments from Witkoff on CNN, it all comes down to the fact that sources are indicating that Putin basically asked Trump and his team whether he can have Donbass. He already occupies around 80%, 88%, around 75% of Donetsk and all of Luhansk. So the option, well, what we had tabled really for months is whether Ukraine was willing to give up some land in exchange for US protection. So that's kind of the significance of that conversation that Witkoff says he's had with Putin, and that Putin's agreed to this Article 5 like protection for Ukraine. Now, the direct quote, he said, we were able to win the following concession, that the US could offer Article 5 like protection, which is one of the real reasons why Ukraine wants to be in NATO. He also said that Russia said it would make a legislative commitment not to go after, any additional territory in Ukraine if land is given to Russia. Now, Scott, how certain can we be that that would be upheld, given that in 94, Russia committed to respect Ukraine's sovereignty and borders, including not invading it?
You just answered your own question. Legislative guarantee. Yeah, like Putin's going to listen to that. Oh God, my hands are tied, boys. I can't use the military again. Everybody knows that's a Krakow, right? So that's not what we're talking about here, Maddie. Let's get to the core of what we are talking about. I think you and I have discussed this, and I know it upsets some of our Ukrainian friends out there, and I understand you're upset by this, but I'm just telling you the line that I think Ukrainian officials, including the Zelensky government, where they've been for months, and that is they haven't really said it publicly until recent weeks. Zelensky's been indicating it now, and that is, look, if we get security guarantees from the West, and that means not only the guarantees they'll protect us against the further Russian attacks, it includes support for our defense industry. It includes support for factories such as drone factories. It includes defense coordination, intelligence coordination. If we get that, almost that we're an associate of NATO, we can accept a Russian occupation of what Russia already has in the short run. But here is the kicker. There are certain red lines. Zelensky and the Zelensky government will not accept legal recognition of those areas, Crimea, southern Ukraine, eastern Ukraine, as Russian. No recognition, right? This is not going to be a carve-up of Ukraine in a legal sense. Secondly, we are talking about the current front lines. We are not going to withdraw from the rest of the Donetsk region, which is probably about 25% of Donetsk, but we're not going to withdraw from that. Now, there's a reason why they won't, and I need to make this clear to our viewers out there. This isn't just for pride. The part of Donetsk that Ukraine still controls, has always controlled during this invasion, is in the northern Donbass. It is a major industrial area. It is a major area. It's a fortified area. That's why they've been able to defend it against every Russian offensive that has taken place in 42 months. If they were to withdraw from those fortified areas in Donetsk, you hand Russia the advantage not only in that Russia now has fortified areas that they can defend, so it makes it tougher to ever negotiate to get that territory back. Russia can use that as a platform to launch a further attack into the rest of Ukraine. The European leaders, when they spoke to Trump last Wednesday, and this was discussed between them, and it was made very clear, and I can't remember, I think it was Mark Rutte. It was Mark Rutte who said, Mr. President, if you give Russia that area of Donetsk, you've given them the highway to Kyiv. They could just use this to launch another an even quicker invasion than they did in February of 22. And that shook Trump. I mean, officials came out and said Trump really took that on. And then, of course, 2 days later, Vlad flips him. But that's why what I'm telling you here is that the deal that is there, and we may edge to it, but it depends on how much Putin feels he's under pressure that he has to accept it. Short-term Russian occupation of the areas that they hold, but in return, Ukraine gets the path to security guarantees on a military basis, and they get the path to what eventually would be EU membership on an economic basis.
So the press conference that we have, you said before, sorry, Scott, that the coalition of the willing are currently meeting. You and I, as we speak, haven't heard anything from that. But what we have seen is that the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and Vladimir Zelensky have had a meeting in Brussels. They've had a press conference. Von der Leyen said, first, we must have strong security guarantees to protect both Ukraine and Europe's vital security interests. She also said that Ukraine must be able to uphold its sovereignty and its territorial integrity, and that Europe believes that international borders cannot be changed by force. Are you thinking that they are preparing for Trump to tell them on Monday that the only way for a peace deal is by Russia occupying Donbass?
Oh, I think they're not only prepared for that, I think they're expecting that's where the landing point is. And that, in a way, don't rule it out that they could have encouraged that with Trump. They won't say it publicly, but they could have privately said to Trump, look, we acknowledge that the Russians aren't going to be forced out. But if the Russians aren't going to be forced out, how is the rest of Ukraine going to be protected? How's the remaining 80% of the country, which is unoccupied, which is sovereign, which is independent, how are we going to protect that? And they've added to the idea of how are we going to protect that is, how are we going to make this economically productive? Because we're dealing with Trump, right? So you talk to Trump about how Ukraine is going to be economically revived. Now, we know that Europe's investing a lot of money in it, but you say to Trump as well, there's a lot of space there for U.S. industry as well, for U.S. U.S. manufacturers. Remember the rare earth mineral deal? Why does Ukraine pursue the rare earth minerals deal? It gets the U.S. invested in Ukraine's economic future because those minerals aren't going to be online for years, many, many years. But in the meantime, you've got Trump thinking, this is it. We can make money out of this place. They're working that with Trump right now. So yeah, I think that's sort of like the space that was left open on Friday. If you read what the EU statements are, and if you read Zelensky, and that is, as much as Trump in effect gave up on the ceasefire, as much as he gave up on toughened sanctions on Moscow, the space that is there is the security guarantees for Ukraine. But what you have to do is you have to push back Putin's demand for all of the Donbass. You've got to push that back. And that's going to be the question when we read what happens on Monday. And the fallout of that is does Trump dig his heels in publicly and say that all of the Donbass must be given to Putin? Or does he not say that publicly, but does he then blame Zelensky and the Europeans for being the barriers to a deal? And that's probably the real risk they're running.
Zelensky, he said in this press conference as well, Scott, he said that Putin has many demands. We do not know all of them. It will take time to go through them, but that it is impossible to do this under the pressure of weapons. Now, do you think the Ukrainian leader is in a roundabout way of saying that a ceasefire should have been brokered on Friday, or at least Trump should have acknowledged why he didn't talk about it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that absolutely. What happened since Friday was interesting. I mean, because the Europeans playing Trump the way they have, and again, full credit to them. I don't like the fact they have to do it, but that is, you can't call Trump out for retreating from the ceasefire commitment that he made only 48 hours earlier. So they're not using the word ceasefire in their statements. You notice they're saying the attacks must stop, but they won't use the word ceasefire. Now, Zelensky did use the word ceasefire today in one of his posts, that there's a need for it, but he didn't link that to criticism of Trump. So we're in the space now, which is, look, we need these attacks to stop, Mr. President, so we have the chance to get your deal. That's what they're talking about. And now that raises another huge question that the media kind of forgot about in the last 48 hours. What has really undone the Russians with the Trump administration, and this goes all the way back to February, when they thought they had it stitched up, a deal with the U.S., Ukraine, and Europe out of the loop, is they didn't stop the attacks on Ukraine civilians, right? And we know that's what really meant they didn't get a deal in the spring that they wanted. And it's what really fouled them up with Trump this summer, because they kept the drone and missile strikes up. And Trump, who's an emotive politician, it's just whatever he feels, all of a sudden people are going to him, including Melania, and saying, they're killing people. They're killing them in the nursing homes. They're killing them in the hospitals. What are you going to do about it? Does Russia back off the drone and missile strikes over the next few days? Overnight, they fired 60 drones and one missile on Ukraine. I think 5 civilians were killed by shelling, not necessarily by the drones or the missiles, and 11 were injured. Now, those numbers are down on the numbers that they have been firing. They've been firing hundreds of drones and missiles on a daily basis in there. Does Russia ease back on those attacks on Ukraine? Certainly, it's not for me to advise Vlad. I think that would be the smart call. But the problem here is he thumps his chest. So he keeps trying to maneuver maneuver Trump, and also try to break the Ukrainians at the same time. If he tries to do that again, I think it'll backfire.
Just finally, Scott, Trump, he posted on True Social in the last few hours, he said, big progress on Russia, stay tuned. It's incredible how the fake news violently distorts the truth. When it comes to me, there is nothing I can say or do that would lead them to write or report honestly about me. I had a great meeting in Alaska on Biden's stupid war, a war that should never have happened. Now, just finally, on that note, I found it really interesting that Putin did come out in his press conference and say that, well, while he can't 100% confirm the war wouldn't have happened if Trump was elected in 2020, he kind of said that perhaps he wouldn't have invaded. Now, of course, that was just a big ego stroke for Trump. But what are your thoughts on this comment from Donald Trump? Big progress on Russia, stay tuned.
Okay, first of all, this deal, 1 point on nonsense and 1 point on very serious sense. 1 point on nonsense is let me just back up before we talk about, Trump's latest thought bubble on Truth Social that you've just quoted. Go back to Friday, and amidst that word salad and the ramble that Trump was putting on, do you remember that he spent a lot of time about it was the Russia hoax, the Russia hoax, the Russia hoax. That's what caused this war, was the Russia hoax. Because if it hadn't been for the Russia hoax, I would have been elected president in 2020. And then Vlad wouldn't have. And I'm like, okay, one, it wasn't a hoax. And hi, all you Trumpists out there, once again, despite the fact that Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, is spinning like a pinwheel trying to put propaganda out there, it was very real that Russia worked with the Trump campaign in 2016. They cooperated. Secondly, the election in 2020 was not rigged. It was real. So therefore, third, we are not in this position because someone did Donald Trump wrong in recent years. It's not necessarily all about your ego, Donald. There are other things that are in play here. But of course, Putin's going to encourage that. I'm so sorry. That election in 2020, that was so rigged, Mr. President. That was so rigged, right? And if you'd been there, it'd be so good. Because how do I know that Vlad said that to Trump? Because Trump went off after all these meetings, when they don't go well, he goes off to his best friend Sean Hannity at Fox. And Sean gives him like a 30-minute ego stroke. You're brilliant, Mr. President. You're brilliant. You're fantastic. You did one for it. And Trump went off on one, which is, Vladimir told me that the 2020 election was all rigged. It was all just like, he told me that. And I'm going, well, Vlad does have experience of rigged elections, but not necessarily the one you're thinking about, Donald. So that's the nonsense part. Here's the sense part. When you cut through that, first of all, Trump's running around saying that he's going to get Zelensky and Putin in on Friday into D.C. That ain't happening unless Putin thinks that they're going to get an unconditional surrender from Zelensky, because Putin doesn't recognize Zelensky as a legitimate president. He doesn't recognize the government of Ukraine. So where are we then? Marathon, not a sprint. The hope here is, from the Europeans and Zelensky, is that before we could get to a possible deal like the deal that we're talking about, the Americans don't cut off their military aid. They don't cut off their financial aid. And in the meanwhile, they step up the pressure on Russia, because that's the other part of the statements that are coming out today. And for those people who are coming out there and say, you've been saying this for 3.5 years, Russia's going to collapse. That's not what we're saying here. We're not talking about the Russian economy collapsing. We're talking about their ability to continue to wage a full-scale invasion. In the past week, Russia has begun issuing gasoline coupons in Crimea and in the far east of Russia. That rationing means that you only get gasoline, petrol, if you're a business or if you're a key administrative organization. That is happening. There are problems with certain parts of the Russian agricultural sector, including potatoes and beet production, that you can look up that are out there. Russian oil revenues have been absolutely pummeled in the last few months. The government deficit is up. Remember that one of the reasons why Putin needed this summit, not wanted it, needed it, was because Trump was threatening tougher sanctions. That economic pressure on Russia's economy is still there, even if Trump backs off the sanctions. And I'll state it out there. I don't like to make predictions, but I would say from talking to military analysts, other good analysts on this, and these aren't pro-Ukrainian folks. They read it as it is. 6 to 12 month window for Russia to try to get their military victory here. So we are still in this position where even if Trump goes walkabout or plays yo-yo, and we do not get the deal that we talked about, short-term Russian occupation in exchange for security guarantees for Ukraine, Ukraine and Europe are not on a losing position. If anything, I think we're in an ongoing stalemate on the front lines, and it's the war beyond the front lines.
So with or without the Europe and Trump, you're saying that Russia only has 6 to 12 months to even fight the war?
I think that they will try to extend it beyond that window if this is still going on. But no, I think probably 6 to 12 months is what you're talking about in terms of the pressure. Because remember, what also compounds this is Ukraine's having increasing success hitting the installations inside Russia. I mean, in the past week, they've hit several oil refineries. They've hit other logistics positions. Usually we're getting 1 to 2 facilities hit every night. And one of the reasons why you're getting the gasoline shortages in Russia is because the oil and gasoline refineries are getting hit.
And continuing to, and that's Ukraine's latest tactic. Well, of course, we saw Operation Spiderweb doing so well, but then that's continued. And after headline after headline, we see Ukrainian army hitting Russian oil refineries. So they'll only keep going, Scott, as the pressure builds. So, Scott Lucas, so thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Maddie, thank you. Now go off and enjoy the rest of your Sunday.